Welcome to the 2021 Sacher Distinguished Lecture in Music. My name is Laura Dolp and I'm a historian here at the Cali School. Every year at the Cali School, we welcome a leading thinker whose innovative work engages music as a cultural form. Practitioners of this kind of contextual and creative thinking provide essential connective tissue between the major disciplinary pursuits at our school. Their work inspires young teachers, therapists, performers, and composers, and points to new models of creativity. At its best, this kind of thinking encourages us to step outside our own artistic practice for a moment to consider how it belongs and how it can continue. Today, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Susan Boyden, an internationally recognized historian of medieval arts culture in Europe. She has written extensively on issues of liturgy and music in medieval monasticism, manuscript studies, music in the Iberian Peninsula, music and childhood, and intersections of music with the visual arts. Her consideration of the ways that visual arts are synergetic with music have been far-reaching. Here at the Cali School, students will recognize my own constant appeal for what I call the historical imagination, particularly as it relates to visual culture, a notion highlighted in the title of an influential book on musical culture written by Leo Treitler over 30 years ago, in which he states, quote, "Again and again, music's demand for our attention to its present beauty and to its power to move the human spirit has been worried over as an obstacle in the way of historical thinking, as a condition that must be dealt with in special ways. But rather than a conceptual obstacle, Treitler argues, music's insistence on its presentness is a benefit to the historical imagination, whose play over the field bounded by past and present is energized by that insistence. The meaningful of music through its many nows, from the moment of its creation to the historian's present, he argues, is the content of historical thought about it. And the presence of music in the historian's consciousness is the condition under which such thought can take place. In the most current thinking, Treitler's appeal to the examination of music's multitude of pasts easily and organically extends to its multitude of experiential references, particularly as it has been evoked in the senses. This fact of rich sensory references is at the heart of Susan Boyden's work. Today, her questions begin where music was understood to be a constituent part of the self, and musical performance was central to the formation of community and the articulation of identity. She offers examples of how medieval images of music reflect the cultural and societal values associated with performance. Finally, she interprets images depicting musical performance, drawing on multidisciplinary analysis of built environments in which that early music was performed. Boynton has published 2 award-winning monographs, the first from 2006, entitled Shaping a Monastic Identity, Liturgy and History at the Imperial Abbey of Farfa, examines the powerful abbey in the 11th and early 12th centuries and how its liturgical practices in the centuries before church ritual was controlled and codified by the papacy. She demonstrates that the liturgy was highly flexible, continually adapting to the monastery's new realities, often in the service of Farfa's power and prestige. She proposes that Farfa, like other monasteries, cathedral chapters, and royal houses, constantly rewrote its history, particularly the stories of its founding, as part of the continuous negotiation of power that was central to medieval politics and culture. In a masterful piece of sleuthing, Boynton's second book from 2011, Silent Music, Medieval Song and the Construction of History in the 18th Century Spain, she sheds light on a Mozart-Arabic liturgical manuscript, an early 11th century book of saints' offices that had been missing from the archive of the Toledo Cathedral since the late 19th century. Tracing the manuscript back to a copy made in Madrid in 1752 by the Jesuit polymath Andres Marcos Birriel, Boynton insightfully explores Birriel's involvement with the manuscript and its attendant meanings. Among her numerous articles and book chapters, she has also co-edited 5 studies, including the practice of the Bible in the Middle Ages, resounding images, medieval intersections of art, music, and sound, from dead of night to end of day, musical childhoods and the cultures of youth, and young choristers, 650 to 1700. Boynton is the general editor of Disciplina Monastica and co-editor of the art history journal Gesta. With the University of Paris, she's organized international workshops for graduate students on the study of images in the humanities. She has also been a project leader for FAB Musiconis, a digital humanities and musical iconography exchange with Paris-Sorbonne University. Dr. Boynton is professor of music at Columbia University. In 2018-2019, she was a resident faculty director of the New Institute for Ideas and Imagination at Columbia's Global Center in Paris. And in 2020, she was named a Chevalier of the Ordre des Palmes Académiques, an honor awarded by the Prime Minister of France. Boynton is a recipient of Columbia University's Distinguished Faculty Award, and her research has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Academy in Rome, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And now, please join me as we turn to the presentation.
The experience and the idea of music are crucial to the received meanings of many works of medieval art. An image could be shaped by abstract ideas about music or influenced by specific impressions of musical performance. Allusions to music in the visual arts, while sometimes seemingly representational, are more often symbolic and even indirect. An image can allow for multiple readings, making it challenging to parse the meaning of visual references to music. The resulting indeterminacy generates unanswerable questions that lead from the idea of music to a wider field of inquiry. Music always points to something beyond itself. In the case of this 12th century stone carving from the Basilica of Mary Magdalene at Vézelay, one may even ask why music was chosen for its subject. Situated atop a column in the nave of the basilica, this capital is located in a space of free circulation, where it could be viewed by lay people, including pilgrims, as well as by the monks of the Benedictine community. It depicts a musician playing while a grotesque creature fondles a woman. Does this carving signal the condemnation of instrumental music as a seductive sound inciting lust? The creature on the corner of the capital is the physical conduit between sounding music and the naked female body. Does he express the effect of music, or is he distracted by the wind instrument? In other words, does the instrument elicit his action or cause him to turn away? Although the message of the capital seems graphic, its meaning remains indeterminate. On some level, the scene suggests a link between musical performance and human behavior, one that has been a preoccupation of philosophers since antiquity. While it cannot be known whether the musician inspires the lascivious act or interrupts it, the turning of the figure's head towards the musician appears to depict the act of hearing. Viewing the capital as a whole by walking around it suggests an unspecified narrative that proceeds from left, where a musician, identifiable with the one playing the wind instrument, faces a woman, to right. Situated in the nave of the Basilica at Vézelay, this capital was visible to the laity along with others displaying equally vivid imagery. The twisted body and wild hair of the grotesque creature and the lascivious act suggest a comparison with the equally contorted figure conventionally identified as despair, which is juxtaposed with lust on another capital also situated in the nave of the basilica. Now, while these capitals from Vézelay were placed high up, but still reasonably visible to anyone who entered the church, this contemporaneous capital, much closer to the viewer, was located in the cloister of the Benedictine Abbey of Cusha. a space for reflection, reading, and ritual accessible only to the monastic community. One face of the Capitol shows a dancing horn player flanked by monstrous mouths devouring human torsos, and the horrific spectacle seems to comment obliquely on the prancing figures in between. Here, a connotation of the musical scene is implied by the corners of the Capitol with the lower half of a human body, apparently half-eaten, protruding from grotesque jaws. One cannot see the prancing musician without simultaneously perceiving the figures surrounding him closely, as their limbs overlap and are just short of being intertwined. The musician's right leg crosses under the left leg of one of the half-devoured figures, while his left foot is poised in mid-air, directly between the feet of two of them. Now, in contrast with the symmetry and the squatting and standing figures in the cloister's other capitals, two of which are shown here, the legs of the prancing entertainers are slightly akilter, their jaunty, off-balance appearance possibly expressing the idea of minstrels as loose livers, in accordance with ecclesiastical opinions at the time. In any case, the boisterous quality of the dancing is conveyed by the feet, which are suspended in the air, unlike the solidly grounded lower members of the various creatures represented on the other capitals. The horn that makes this a musical image is also found in contexts not associated with dancing, as in this ivory plaque from the 11th century, made in northern Spain, where the horn is played by a humble shepherd, Saint Emilian. The vielle that is attached to his cloak reflects a detail in the saint's biography, which was chanted in the liturgy of his feast days and was the source for both the subjects of the scenes and the inscriptions carved in the arches. This text, The Saint's Life, states that, like King David, Emilian had a cithara to prevent idleness while he guarded his flock. The cithara is interpreted here as a bowed instrument. It's an early example of the vielle worn on the coat of the wind player in the Vézelay Capitol. The fact that the horn and the vielle are depicted so similarly in such different contexts reminds us that instruments bore a broad range of significations. As the monks of Cusha encountered the musician capital daily throughout a cloistered lifetime, how did this image become internalized? How are musical images informed by the spaces they occupy and by the spaces in which music is performed? In spaces with a particular function, the visual representation of music takes on a heightened meaning from its architectural setting. In the case of the Vézelay Capitol, for instance, its received meaning as a story about laypeople seems fitting for, and perhaps determined by, the nave of the basilica where it is placed. How do spaces reflect, both literally and metaphorically, sounding performance that occurs within them? This last question touches on the relationship between architecture and music, and the activation of buildings through musical performance. The activation of a medieval building by liturgical singing is directly illustrated by a rich open-access website created by the architectural historian Stephen Murray about the northern French cathedral of Amiens. An early music vocal ensemble based in France produced sound recordings that demonstrate the acoustics of 3 locations within the Gothic cathedral. The musical repertoire chosen illustrates the different styles of music sung in the cathedral, from plain chant to polyphony, and from the 13th century to the 15th. Microphones were placed in the choir in a position at the crossing, outside the choir, and in the nave. Thus, one can hear the sound of the same musical examples in each of these 3 locations and toggle between them while listening. Now let's listen to some examples from the website. First, we will listen to a chant sung by choir and soloist in alternation, the first item in this list, and we will toggle between the different locations to see the volumes of space in the cathedral. Now, listening even to the chant selection, we can hear how extremely different the level of reverberation is and the length of it in the different parts of the cathedral. Let's hear a piece of polyphony that would have been sung in the 13th century in Amiens Cathedral, and we'll think about how the spaces of the cathedral, the extraordinarily high vaults, affect how we perceive the sound of the same singers from the three locations. How the sound becomes clearer as you approach the choir and stand under the crossing. Inside the choir, if we listen to another, now the latest chronologically of the examples, a motet by Jean Mouton, we can see how the voices seem to multiply when we listen from outside the choir and become even more diffuse and blended and sound almost like a larger ensemble when we listen in the nave. Now we'll listen to an example from the last period represented in the website, a part of a Kyrie by the composer Jean Mouton, who was working at Amiens Cathedral around 1500. So this is typical of the kind of polyphony that would have been sung in the choir during Mass in the years around 1500. First, we'll hear it in the choir, where the sound is the driest and the least resonant, then in the middle of the church, and then in the nave. And you'll notice the tremendous difference between the perception of the sound from these three locations. It is truly the cathedral itself, the building, that is part of the performance, as well as the singers. It is producing the sound along with the choir. how vividly music was evoked in medieval architectural sculpture and how the study of acoustics brings to life a building in which musical performance took place. Let us now turn to the visual evocation of music in two-dimensional spaces of illuminated manuscripts. The interpolated, expanded version of the Roman de Fauvel, produced around 1317, in close proximity to the French royal household, offers a multi-layered experience of narrative, accompanied and complemented by music and images. This manuscript conveys some of the vividness of a colorful urban ritual known as the Sharavari, a boisterous custom of disturbing the peace on the night before a wedding. The notoriously noisy ritual was usually planned by a group of young men to protest the remarrying of widows or marriages between people far apart in age. The Sharavari was the occasion for wildly disruptive behavior, banging on pots and pans, making a mess, and many of the other forms of ritual clowning that existed in the Middle Ages. Those who took part in the Sharavari would have put on masks and costumes intended to make them appear grotesque, even monstrous, as seen here, where they performed the antithesis of a serenade as the allegorical personage of the evil, ambitious Fauvel in the upper register, a hybrid with a horse's head and a man's lower body, approaches the bed of his equally allegorical newlywed, Vainglory. The manuscript combines verbal description, visual depiction, and street songs in a multimedia portrayal of the madcap Sharavari in all its sonic excess. The written music and the textual narrative, together with the illustrations, convey the temporality of converging voices and events. The demon, Helquin, comes with rattling wagons that make sounds described in the text. As Emma Dillon has written, the description of diverse sounds creates a true multimedia presentation of the Sharavari, reporting things heard overlapping and simultaneously in the frenzied ritual, all parts of one monstrous chorus. The performativity of the interpolated Roman de Fauvel, the way in which it's a veritable performance on the page, highlights music's ability to structure time. How does our perception of musical time relate to our visual perception of images? Music unfolds in a linear sequence. Reading, hearing, or remembering music creates one temporal dimension, while viewing an image creates another. Just as musical form adds a layer of structure to the textual forms of vocal music, viewing a musical manuscript allows us to experience the temporalities of sound and image together. Performer, listener, and viewer all contribute to the experience of sound and image as intersecting media. Studying these complementary aspects of perception presents a challenge, not only because hearing and seeing are different physical acts, but also because sound and image differ both in their temporal and material expressions. Time, in particular, functions differently as a parameter in the visual arts and in music. How does our oral perception of musical time relate to our visual perception of an image? Music unfolds in real time and is heard in linear sequence. Hearing a musical composition is inherently more constrained by the passage of time than the process of viewing an image. Likewise, visual and oral media also differ markedly in their physical manifestations, the traces they leave behind. In medieval music, and to some extent in all music, the substance of a composition is essentially reconstructed through the act of performance. The written record of musical notation and text transmits a circumscribed quantity and scope of information. For most of the Middle Ages, music manuscripts did not typically serve as performance scores, but rather as references for a very limited number of users. Music books could also function as visual objects, works of art, in addition to transmitting their musical contents. Temporal differences between visual and oral perception are particularly noticeable in this presentation of a macho virelais that is part of his narrative poem, The Remède de Fortune. Here, the linear movement of music is joined by another form that unfolds in time, the round dance, whose circular movement matches the cyclic nature of the musical and poetic form, the virelais, which Machaut calls a chanson baladée, literally a danced song. It contains a refrain strophe that is repeated between each of the verses, and the last section of each verse is sung to the melody of the refrain. And this is shown here in the color-coded text and translation. In vocal music, the combination of musical and textual structure creates a layering of perception. The simple musical poetic structure of the virelai creates a sense of constant returning to the same melodic and verbal material in performance. This cyclical song is dynamic rather than static. The singer and the listener must adapt the music to successive strophes of the text, which in the manuscript is written on the verso, as you can see here on the right. Although the melody remains the same, the ideas in the text change, and our understanding of the song develops as it unfolds over time. Yet it always returns to its beginning. Machaut emphasizes the circularity of the virelai form by crafting the melodic phrases in synchrony with enjambment in the text. He created both poem and melody, and it is thought that he supervised the production of this manuscript of his works. Let us listen to the virelai.
Cum a toute la milior qu'on puis choisir, ne qui vivre ne mourir puis à ce jour. Si ne me doit à faux lourd, tourner ce jeu vous a qu'à s'en mentir, montez passez en valour, tout est fleur en douce odeur qu'on peut sentir, votre beauté fait à rire, tout anéantir, et vos douceurs passent tout, rose en couleur vous devez tenir, et vos regards peut guérir toute douleur. Dame à vos cendres tolir, d'un cœur pensé désir, corps et amour, comme à toute la meilleure qu'on puisse choisir, qui vivre de mourir puis à ce jour. Pour ce table je m'attourde, très toute ma vigueur à vous servir, et mes années vilain tour, mon cœur, ma vie, moudurant vos plaisirs, et ce petit consentir veut que me daignes ouïr en ma clamour. Je ne quière de mon labour à autre me rire, qu'il ne me pourrait venir jouer grignoul. Dame à vos cendres tolir, d'un cœur pensé désir, corps et amour, comme à toute la meilleure qu'on puisse choisir, ne qui vivre ne mourir puis à ce jour. Dame sont tués mes retours, souvent mes tués tant des tours plaindre et gemir, et présente-vous des couleurs, quand vous ne savez l'ardeur qui a souffrir, pour vous qu'entendez désir, que plus ne le puis couvrir, et ce tanrour n'en avait en grand tristour mes tués venir, non pour quand je mourir votre demour. Dame à vos cendres tolir, d'un cœur pensé désir, corps et amour, comme à toute la meilleure qu'on puisse choisir, ne qui vivre ne mourir puis à ce jour.
The virelai is embedded in a trajectory that foregrounds the representation of the protagonist, called the lover, as a poet-composer. In the course of the narrative, he is depicted 4 times in the act of composing or performing his own songs. First, we see the lover making a lay, then, a bit later, a ballade. He sings the virelai at a festive gathering, and then eventually he departs, singing a rondelet. This song, the Virelai, is preceded by an encounter with the lady, who appears suddenly and invites the protagonist to dance. Although nervous, he joins the round dance, and after a little while, the lady tells him that it is his turn to sing. The lover demurs, he claims to know little about singing, and then finally he begins the song. The graphic rendering of the song comprises both the static notation of the music, that is a snapshot, and the illustration with the implied movement of the dancing group. The musical form of the Virelai and the image of the round dance constitute parallel representations of cyclicity, inviting a comparison between the structures of music, text, movement, and their temporalities. Another instance of the round dance appears in the Cantigas de Santa Maria. This collection of 400 songs in honor of the Virgin Mary was composed in Galician Portuguese and assembled at the court of Alfonso X, also known as the Wise, King of Castile and Leon in the second half of the 13th century. Most of the songs tell stories, but every 10th song in the collection is a praise song, a lyric without narrative. The cantigas are transmitted in 3 richly illuminated manuscripts that often exhibit a complex relationship between the miniatures and the text. Here you see one panel from Cantiga 120, a praise song. This composition depicts Alfonso X in front of what appears to be a statue of the Virgin and Child, gesturing to a group of musicians and dancers. This presentation of Alfonso as mediator illustrates the refrain of the song, "All who believe me will praise the Virgin who sustains us." The image refers back to other images of the wise king in the illuminated manuscripts of the Cantigas, where he is presented as the troubadour of Mary, dictating the songs to assembled scribes and musicians, but in this case, Alfonso is not transmitting music. Instead, the musicians and dancers seem to be joined with him in praise of the Virgin Mary. The composition recalls images of another king whose name was linked with the divine songs of praise, King David, to whom medieval writers attributed all the Psalms. King David was often depicted with musicians because of the instruments mentioned in the Psalms, and in particular, Psalm 150, which mentions the instruments typically found in angel concerts. Although the Cantigas illustration is not an angel concert, it does present the combination of instruments typically found in many of these concerts, minus the percussion, and this is one example, in where you see the text of Psalm 150, praise him with the sound of trumpet, praise him with psaltery and harp, praise him with timbrel and choir, and with strings and organs and high-sounding cymbals. And in the very, very crowded scene here, all of those instruments are represented. Now, in the scene from the Cantigas, we can identify several of the instruments. One of them is the Arab qanun, representing the multicultural character of Alfonso's court, and also the psaltery, seen here in a reconstruction of a medieval psaltery, and then in the differently shaped examples in the Cantigas illumination, and the vielle, which was associated with minstrels in this period primarily, as we've already seen, and there are several cantigas about minstrels who play the instrument, as seen here on the right. Another example from the 13th century shows the vielle among the instruments being played by those gazing on the Lamb at the Apocalypse. Now, although this scene is very different from the one in the Cantigas, it does include a crowded group in which there are musicians playing plucked, bowed, and wind instruments in an act of divine praise. In the Cantigas illumination, the musicians are complemented by the dancers who are holding hands in what seems to be a round dance while they sing. Visually, this resembles secular dances depicted in 14th century manuscripts, as we saw in the Virelai by Machaut, called the chanson baladée, the danced song, in the Remède de Fortune, and also in the Carole de Déduit, the carol, the round dance of joy, in the Roman de la Rose, a text of the 13th century illustrated here in a 14th century manuscript. It could also be a sacred dance of praise. So this illumination from the cantigas illustrates the affirmation repeated often throughout the cycle that music is a fitting tribute and offering to the Virgin Mary. The representation of Alfonso with his musicians refers both to the idea of music as praise in general and perhaps also indirectly to the making of the cantigas as a body of song. The text of the individual song that this illustration accompanies makes no reference to instruments or to music, but only to the idea of believing in the Virgin Mary. The musical performance in this image is thus a visual expression of the ideal of that belief, a musical ideal. The interpretation of musical scenes requires comparative analysis of images, and such analysis has been significantly advanced in recent years by multidisciplinary collaborations in the field of musical iconography, particularly the Musiconis project. Most recently, an exchange between Columbia University and Paris-Sorbonne Université, made possible by a 3-year grant from the Cultural Services of the French Embassy, gave graduate students in several disciplines of the humanities a well-rounded formation in digital humanities approaches to the analysis and description of medieval images of music. Students learned historical, critical, and technical methods for creating new database records in the Musiconis database, which gathers and classifies musical images from the long Middle Ages, drawn from existing image databases. And now I'm going to show a couple of ways in which one can use the database. So for instance, in preparation for this presentation today, looking for images of the Vielle, I found a great many results, and in the database, you can filter. So if you want to look for images from just the 13th century, you can filter out the other ones by unchecking the boxes and hitting filter, and then you end up with a smaller number of results. Many of them, as you'll see, in manuscripts, and the very last result is the one I showed, which comes from a partner database of manuscript illumination, Biblissima. And if we go to that partner database, then we can see a downloadable image, the metadata in French. There's also a link to the Gallica database of the Bibliothèque Nationale, which has the entire manuscript. And if we go back to the Musiconis entry, we can see that it exists in English and also the original in French, and then in Spanish as well. And it includes information that is musical metadata specifically. For instance, under performance, you can see the Hornbostel-Zach's system of classification for the instruments has been added. And these is the kind of metadata that's added to many of the existing records from the source databases. Another search that can be done is for that dance that we were discussing earlier, the carole, the round dance. And in fact, although this is not how I originally found it, that image that I showed is represented here. And it gives you then the classification of the musician and information on the shape of the instrument, the number of sound holes, the placement of the bow. You can also, from here, link out to the source database, which is another database of illuminated manuscripts in France, Initial. And that already useful record links you out to yet another database, which is one including numerous digitized images from the same manuscript. So from the Musiconis database, you can get not only the results, varied results, but also you can find a lot of information from the partner databases. Here, another record showing a different carole, a different round dance, illustrates the fact that it's not only the vielle, but also, in this case, a wind instrument, which is accompanying the dance, the trumpet. It's in another medium, and this is related to the Gothic ivories database. So that was the source database. As a subfield of cultural history, the study of musical images can help us reach a more refined understanding of human emotions, ideas, and behaviors, even outside the context of musical performance. Images of music point beyond themselves in a manner that is mimetic and symbolic, literal and figurative, performative and abstract. The idea of music functions as a powerful signifier because music was part of the daily lives of those who created and consumed images, just as it is in today's world.